So I wanted to revisit our old friend, the ego, this morning, because I think it's important periodically to remind ourselves of the role of the ego in so much of our suffering. And the Buddha never talked about the ego per se. He talked about the self. We've just sort of uh, translated in Western Buddhism anyway into talking about the ego, not in the Freudian sense, but in the sense of this idea of a fixed self, or at least fixed ideas about who we are. And the challenge is to develop a healthy skill ego with sort of skillful expressions of that ego, um, that recognizes its sort of ever-changing quality and how it sort of adapts to all these different situations. But a perspective which frees us from any fixed ideas about who or what we are, because we're constantly kind of in flux, and particularly when those fixed ideas hold on to or grasp onto any sense of self-importance or grandiosity or self-aggrandizement. Um, Over my many years professionally, I can tell you that I saw every day in my office the suffering caused by unskillful management of the ego. I mean, it's just one way to think about human suffering, which kind of is a wide, big umbrella. And, much of that suffering is a function of trying to protect the ego, uh, helping, finding ways for the ego to get admiration, to avoid shame and invalidation, or putting up walls or means to avoid that. And the ego internalizes over the course of our life all the successes and failures of our lives, all of our joys and sorrows. It's our conscious self. It's how we interact with the world. It's who we tell ourselves we are. It's our identity, if you will. But often we distort that out of self-interest or the wish to kind of push aside the the less appealing aspects of who we are. So we can either inflate it, in the extremes. We can either inflate it, with sort of narcissism, sense of self-importance, or we often experience it as deflated, with low self-esteem and depression and the like. Or ideally, we can have a balanced and realistic sense of who we are, which both acknowledges our strengths and our less attractive qualities. But it is never fixed or static. It's constantly changing from moment to moment, depending on external circumstances, depending on internal circumstances. Pat Coffey, a colleague and teacher, some of often talks about, what's the weather system internally? What's the weather system for the ego today when we get out of bed in the morning? But suffice it to say that the ego, as is true for our whole human experience, seeks pleasure and wants to avoid discomfort or pain. The ego seeks happiness, gratification, recognition, the fulfillment of sensual desire, And so all of that is subsumed under the ego. Everything we identify with, our gender, our age, our race, our socioeconomic status, our preference for food, our favorite color, all of that we identify with is subsumed under this umbrella of the ego. It's the conscious experience of who we are in the world. And very often we unconsciously try to edit out, as I said, the negative qualities. Okay. Um, when we feel adequate, our ego feels pride. When we feel successful, our ego feels pride. When we feel disappointed in ourselves or inadequate, we feel shame. We feel we want to hide that part. So we get inflated when we feel pride in what we do and what the ego expresses, and deflated when we don't do so well. But what happens is, if we're not skillful about it, is the ego seeks to meet the world in this kind of pride-filled way, uh, putting out our most attractive traits. We want it we want the world to see us in a positive light. We try to keep hidden our shameful parts. We don't want it because we're afraid we'll be judged. We're afraid we'll be rejected. We're afraid we'll be seen as defective. But we all have that stuff. We just hide it. At the end of the day, the ego is all about I, me, and my. My this, my that, me. And because of that, it's where emotional reactivity originates. Okay, it's where I get triggered. It's where I want to be reactive if you question me, if you invalidate me, if you insult me, if you hurt me. The ego and its need to protect itself will want to react back. It's also where the three poisons that the Buddha taught of greed, hatred, and delusion express themselves. Okay. It's the source of where we compare ourselves to others. And it's the source of where we compare ourselves to external standards, okay, the cultural standards. But all that being said, it's not something we can get rid of even if we want to. We need an ego to function in the world. It's how we interact with others, with their environment, with our environment, and so forth. But that said, we need to see and be realistic and be brutally honest about where it causes us great suffering, where it causes us alienation from others, where it causes separation from others, where it causes separation from our community. So the task here, as always, is mindful noticing, pausing and discerning whenever the ego's needs arise, especially in unskillful ways that cause us harm or cause us suffering or causes others suffering. Okay. We have agency to manage the unwholesome aspects of our ego only if we are aware of them. If we deny them, if I deny that I'm irritable, if I deny that I'm impatient, I have no ability to manage that more skillfully. Others see it, but I'm sort of either excusing it or justifying it, but I'm not saying, yeah, I need to deal with this. I need to take care of this unskillful part of myself. Because a healthy ego lives in the present moment as much as possible. It lets go of fixed ideas of who I am. I'm so wonderful. I'm terrific, whatever. Or I'm terrible. I mean, either fixed ideas about that are either positive or negative. And a skillful managed ego guides us toward our interconnectedness with all other things and all other people. It's spacious. We see it in the larger context. It's less about our selfish motives, about me, and more about community and more about the greater good. Now, I know that sounds like a lofty goal, but that becomes our aspiration with this practice. Okay. And we use the tools that we have, like our impulse control, to put the brakes on our worst tendencies. This is what's called executive function. This is what the prefrontal lobes do. They put the brakes on our less skillful activities, our less skillful responses, our reactivity. But we have to give it time to sort of kick in to come online. Because if we go with reactivity, which is very reflexive, we're probably going to act unskillfully when challenged and so forth. Part of that is cultivating a healthy and honest sense of who we are, warts and all. Okay. Well, I don't deny my problematic attitudes. I don't deny my problematic behaviors. Instead, I work to recognize them and accept them. Recognize and accept them. But I can only do this when I honestly admit them, when I honestly embrace them. If I'm disavowing them, if I'm shoving them off to the side, as I said, I have no agency, I have no ability to deal with my impatience, my irritability, my short fuse, whatever it is that might be coming up. Okay. Now, I'm not talking here about, that the work with ego is we renounce all earthly pleasures. We just engage in self-denial or asceticism. We wear a hair shirt. No, I'm not talking about denying the joy in our lives. I'm not talking about denying having a good time. I'm talking about a balanced reassessment of who and what we are. Shorn of all the baggage that we pile on to look good, to reassure ourselves, to deny our negative qualities, to support our self-delusion. I'm talking about accepting the totality of who we are and then going into the world with that acceptance. And what that will do is give us the option, as I said, to manage the parts of ourselves which are unskillful. So that's a kind of a brief review and revisiting of our good old friend the ego. It's there all the time. It's there to challenge us. It requires constant vigilance on our part in terms of our mindful presence. But it's also, the source of everything we do in the world. So let me leave it there, and let's talk about the ego.